when Donald Trump announced the deal of the century, and he cut off funding to the UNRWA, and Israel announced after that that by June 2019 it would go ahead with its plan to annex parts of West Bank as sort of laid out in the deal of the century. And so Palestinian Authority, this kind of like destroyed the security coordination between Fatah and Israel, and the PA cut off all diplomatic ties, all communication with Israel, and they became very close to Hamas. And sort of negotiations and talks started again between the two sides about holding elections. In fact, the two sides agreed to hold elections in June, which is this month. But just a month ago, the Palestinian Authority leader he indefinitely postponed the elections. The main reason for that is essentially, or at least what Hamas believes, is that if elections had been held at this point in time, then Hamas would have won the election and would have essentially come to power also in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority has said that those claims are false, but there is some truth to it, and we'll get to it a bit later in the presentation. In Israel, Israel's sort of been in political turmoil over the past 2 years. It started with when allegations of corruption were made against the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The Israeli Supreme Court indicted Netanyahu on these charges just about one and a half years ago. In the past 2 years, 4 elections have been held in Israel, and all 4 times, not just Netanyahu, but also other political leaders within the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, they've been unable to form coalition governments. And one of the main reasons for this is that any form of coalition government at this point needs the support of the right-wing parties, as well as the Arab parties. And the right-wing parties are not, the right-wing Jewish parties, that is, are not very comfortable with forming a coalition with the Arab parties. So the way things stand right now is last month, Netanyahu lost his mandate. So the president had given him the mandate to form the coalition government. Netanyahu comes from a party called Likud, which is center-right. And he was forming a coalition with right-wing parties within the Knesset. But he needed the support of the Arab parties. The right-wing parties were not very happy with this, so he was not able to form a government. So the president essentially gave Yair Lapid, he's basically a center party leader, opposition leader at this point. And today, in fact, in a few hours, he and Naftali Bennett together, who is a right-wing party leader, are expected to announce a coalition government along with the Ram party, which is an Arab party. Again, if they are not able to, it's expected that they will form a coalition government, but if it's announced that they're not able to, then Israel will go into a 5th election in 2 years. Aside from the local actors, I also want to talk about some of the main international actors that are involved in this conflict and who play a very, very major role. First is Iran, and Iran has been Hamas's primary backer, in the region for decades now. And this is actually, this is where a lot of other countries sort of in the Middle East sort of come in. And here is because Iran's influence has been increasing across the Middle East. And this is not just of concern for Israel, which is literally Iran's sworn enemy, just to put it colloquially, but also for some of the other countries in the Gulf region. And this is primarily Saudi Arabia, which is over here. You have Bahrain, somewhere over here. You have the UAE. Kuwait, Oman, none of these countries are very sort of keen on Iran's influence increasing in the region. And how it looks right now is Iran has major influence in Iraq, which is over here. In fact, the Iraqi government is a coalition government at this point, and the 2 parties which hold majority have very, very close ties with Iran. There are also multiple militias, which are sort of armed groups that operate in Iraq at this point. The main one is the Popular Mobilization Units, which is almost as big as the Iraqi army, and they've been fighting with the army, alongside the army against the Islamic State. And so Iran has a lot of influence in Iraq. It also has a lot of influence in Syria over here. It actually has ground troops on the ground fighting alongside the forces of President Bashar al-Assad. It has a lot of influence in Lebanon. And this is through one of its proxies called Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is literally the crown jewel of Iran's, sort of backed forces in the Middle East. Hezbollah doesn't just have influence in Lebanon, it also has a lot of influence in Syria, in Latin America. And Hezbollah right now, Hezbollah-backed parties are, hold the majority in the Lebanese parliament. Aside from that, they have influence in Yemen through their backed proxy called the Houthis, who are currently engaged in a civil war against Saudi-backed forces. And you have Hamas, over here in Gaza Strip. Hamas does have some influence in the West Bank, but not too much at this point. So yeah, Iran has been a major actor, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for decades at this point. But aside from Iran, you also have over here, you'll see aside from Ayatollah Khamenei, this is the president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. And Egypt's played a very important role in the conflict in Israel and the Palestinian territories, especially since the 1990s. Egypt was the first Arab country to recognize Israel. They signed an accord with Yasser Arafat, who was the prime minister of the Palestinian Authority at that point. And Egypt has helped broker most all of these ceasefire agreements that we've sort of talked about every time hostilities escalate in the region. And under Abdel Fattah el-Sisi in Egypt, who's been in power since 2013, he's been trying to sort of position Egypt as a regional power broker in the Middle East. And he's a very egoistic sort of man. He was a general in the military. He came to power after a military coup. And Egypt's always had very close ties with the United States. And under Trump, these ties actually improved significantly. But since Biden came to power in January 2021, he's been highly critical of Sisi because of Egypt's poor human rights record. And in fact, he's had no diplomatic communication with Sisi, which hasn't gone down well with Egypt. And what's interesting this time, which we'll sort of get into later on, is that every time things have escalated between Israel and the Palestinian territories in the past, Egypt's jumped into it almost immediately to help, sort of broker a ceasefire. But this time, Egypt did not do that for almost a week. And it's only after Biden gave him a call telling him that, Egypt plays a very strategic role in the Middle East and, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the next day, the ceasefire was kind of signed. Egypt sent delegations to both sides to kind of, bring the two together. So it's not just local dynamics, but it's a lot of larger geopolitical sort of issues and, international relations and foreign policy that kind of have an impact on the conflict on the ground. And this is just sort of the statement, describing sort of the call that Biden and Sisi had on 20th of May. Now, we'll go a bit more into the main triggers of the latest escalation. This time, this was the largest escalation that we've seen in this conflict since 2014, when, we had Operation Protective Edge. And, we've had much more, sensitive issues over the past years, when US recognized Jerusalem as, part of Israel, or the capital of Israel, and, announced the deal of the century. We did see hostilities, but they were not even half as bad as the scale at which we saw them this time. And those were much more sensitive issues. So why is it that this time hostilities sort of expanded and sort of continued for like almost 10 to 12 days? And these are some of the triggers that we'll talk about. So tensions had been rising in the region from the 12th of April. That is when Ramadan, it's pronounced as Ramadan in the Middle East. When Ramadan started, essentially tensions started rising in the region. And this is primarily because the Israeli police, it shut off access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Temple Mount compound, which is in the old city in Jerusalem. And this was perceived by the Palestinians as an infringement upon, the religious freedom, especially considering that, they had cordoned off the area during such a holy period for Muslims. The Israeli police says that it did that because of, restrictions on COVID-19 gatherings. But regardless of the reason that it was sort of, cordoned off, this, created a lot of unrest, especially in Jerusalem. We saw a major increase in attacks on the Jewish community in Jerusalem, which in turn triggered attacks by far-right Jews against Arabs living in Jerusalem. And over, the course of 2 weeks, intercommunal tensions reached such a high point that we started seeing riots all across Jerusalem, which, let me tell you, is, we see some sort of tensions, but all-out riots in Jerusalem are very rare. aside from these intercommunal tensions, which are increasing in Jerusalem, we also had tensions that were increasing in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. So Jerusalem, as of now, it's sort of divided into two. The western part is under Israel, and the eastern part is under, the Palestinian Authority, the West Bank. And Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem. And what basically happened was an Israeli court issued a verdict just a week before these sort of hostilities broke out, saying that the homes in Sheikh Jarrah belonged to Jewish families before the war in 1948, and these families were displaced. And while the Israeli court did not issue any kind of, eviction notice, this significantly increased concerns in Sheikh Jarrah among Palestinian families that, this means that they're going to be evicted out of Sheikh Jarrah, which probably would have happened, to be very honest. So we saw like major riots break out in Sheikh Jarrah between the Jewish and the Arab community, and the whole city was sort of cordoned off. And this issue became sort of a rallying point, especially considering intercommunal tensions were already rising in the western part of Jerusalem. And we saw multiple protests, not just in the region, but also across the globe, in solidarity with the Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah. At the same time, to kind of show solidarity with Palestinians in Jerusalem, we had groups in Gaza Strip launch rocket attacks towards Israel. Now, if you see, I mentioned a word called symbolic rocket attacks. And the reason I say symbolic is because at this point, we were seeing only about 1 or 2 rocket launches into Israel, and that also only southern part of sort of Israel, and which is very, very common. Not super common, it doesn't happen every month, but like every few months, we see a few rockets being launched. And so that's why it was just meant to be symbolic. It wasn't meant to escalate. The hostilities weren't meant to escalate. Hamas was not interested in an all-out sort of escalation with Israel at this point, or all-out armed conflict. And so we only saw 1 or 2 rockets being launched symbolically. By the way, Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad are in possession of rockets that can reach all the way up till northern Israel, can basically cover all of Israel. The radius is, the range is that long. So again, that's the reason I mentioned symbolic. But these rocket attacks then stopped. But what happened was all of these sort of tensions culminated over this 3-day period, where 2 very, very symbolic dates sort of coincided for the Palestinians as well as the Israelis. One is Al-Quds Day. And Al-Quds Day is basically celebrated by Muslim majority countries in the Middle East. It was started by Iran in the 20th century. It's sort of a annual celebration, sort of where people come out on the streets, sort of march in solidarity with the Palestinians. Al-Quds Day is not celebrated so much in the Palestinian territories, more in other countries in the Middle East. But the fact that Al-Quds Day sort of overlapped with Jerusalem Day sort of significantly increased tensions. Jerusalem Day, on the other hand, is essentially celebrated by the Jewish community, especially the far right, to commemorate the day that Israel took control of the western part of Jerusalem from Jordan after, I think it was the 1967 war, 73 war, I'm slightly uncertain. So basically what happens on Jerusalem Day is that over 30 to 50,000 Jews, they essentially march from the western part of Jerusalem. Okay, so through the Old City. Old City is essentially sort of between East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem. And Old City is divided up into 4 quarters. So if you ever go, it's like quite geometrical. So you have 4 quarters. One is the Arab quarter, one is the Christian quarter, one is the Jewish quarter, and one is the Armenian quarter. And normally Jews don't venture into the Muslim quarter. And what happened was that on Jerusalem Day, there's a march that is organized called the Flags March. And so basically they march from Western Jerusalem to the Western Wall, which is right next to Al-Aqsa Mosque, and which is a very holy site for the Jews. And so this time they decided that the route of the Flags March will go through the Muslim quarter and through the Damascus Gate, which is one of the 5 gates that leads into that entire area of the Western Wall and the mosque. And this really, really increased tensions. In fact, a lot of Israeli intelligence agencies, the Mossad, the Shabak, IDF, all of them told the Israeli police to change the route because it will lead to riots. But after some evaluation, the Israeli police said, no, we'll secure the route. And what essentially happened over the course of the day is that every time some Palestinians would sort of mobilize in a certain area, they would use tear gas to and other riot dispersal measures to make them disperse essentially from that area. And this was perceived and probably was excessive use of force towards Palestinians, and it really, really increased tensions. So everything sort of culminated over this 3-day period, and we saw, a major increase in hostilities. We saw an increase in intercommunal tensions in Jerusalem. We saw riots. We saw, riots in Sheikh Jarrah. We saw a lot of civil unrest break out in the West Bank, and we saw an increase in rocket fire from the Gaza Strip against Israel. Now, hostilities weren't just taking place, as the news would like you to believe, between Gaza and Israel. They actually broke out on multiple fronts, like I mentioned. We saw riots in Jerusalem. This is West Bank over here. And we essentially saw, a major increase in civil unrest, with both sides essentially attacking each other. We also saw, an increase in rocket fire from Gaza Strip. And what was really different about this round of hostilities, again, initially it was, very low scale. They were launching rockets only towards southern Israel. And knowing that almost every time, there's any kind of security incident from Gaza, Israel retaliates with airstrikes. Initially, Israel also showed some sort of restraint. It only attacked, certain weapons depots and weapon storages of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But over time, as tensions kept increasing in Jerusalem and the West Bank, Hamas and the PIJ started firing rockets towards Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, which are located over here. Jerusalem's here, Tel Aviv's here. And this is considered a red line by Israel, so it triggered a harsher retaliation by Israel. They started assassinating high-level Hamas leaders. They, in fact, managed to kill the top leader of the PIJ. Now, again, that triggered retaliation from the Gaza Strip. So that's sort of like spiraled. So even though both sides did not want an escalation, once hostilities start, any kind of miscalculation by either side could just make everything spiral into major armed conflict. Aside from the Gaza Strip, we also saw hostilities break out along the Lebanese border and the Syrian border. So we have a lot of, like I mentioned, Iran has presence on the ground in Syria. It has multiple groups that it backs. So we saw on one occasion, these Iran-backed groups over here, which primarily Hezbollah, they launched rockets into the Israeli side of Golan Heights. Golan Heights is also divided into two parts in Syria, part is in Israel. Again, we only saw that on one occasion, so it was more symbolic. It wasn't meant to, again, open up a new front. On two occasions, we saw rockets being launched by Palestinian groups from southern Lebanon into northern Israel. Again, initially, a lot of people thought that was Hezbollah was responsible behind this, but Hezbollah immediately came out and said that it's not involved in this, and it's not interested in, going into sort of hostilities, starting hostilities with Israel at this point. But to some extent, Hezbollah probably allowed that because southern Lebanon is a major stronghold of Hezbollah, and nothing happens there without their know-how. But within a few hours, the Lebanese armed forces, in fact, arrested these guys and prevented them from launching further rockets into Israel and opening up another sort of front for war. Aside from this, tensions were also rising within Israel. So 1/3 of the population of Israel are Arabs and 2/3 are Jews. And essentially what happened was certain towns, they're purely, sort of populated by the Jewish community, and there are certain towns which are purely populated by the Arab community. But there are certain towns which are mixed towns. So we do have Jews as well as Muslims living together. And tensions increased a lot in these towns. And we saw, it reached such a major point, and that there's a town over here called Lod, and major riots broke out with, the Arabs attacking the Jews attacking the Arabs. Things escalated to a point that, the Israeli government had to declare an emergency. They shut the borders to the town. They declared a night curfew to sort of ensure, that the violence kind of subsided. By the way, those tensions are still high. They've sort of reduced the restrictions, but we're still seeing violence in mixed towns within Israel at this point. Now, why, again, like I mentioned, why was it that this round of hostilities, why did this escalate so much? And both sides have, their reasons. And I'll start with Israel. There are a few things that are happening at the same time. And one is, like I mentioned, Israel has gone through 4 elections over the past 2 years. And the reason that Netanyahu was not able to form a government, like I mentioned, is because he needed the support of the right wing. And in the past, Netanyahu has been highly criticized by right-wing parties within the Knesset for signing ceasefires with Hamas and for not taking a much stricter stance against Hamas. So if coalition formation was to succeed, everybody needed to keep the right-wing parties happy at this point. Second reason being that Tel Aviv and Jerusalem is an absolute red line for Israel. So while we've seen attacks in the past which have been, of high sophistication or even more numbers. We've seen like 2,000, 3,000 rockets being launched, but they've never been launched at Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Maybe one towards Tel Aviv once in a while, but this is an absolute red line. The third is that once these hostilities started, for Israel, it was about restoring deterrence. It was about sending the message to Hamas that you cannot just fire, rockets towards major economic and commercial hubs within Israel without any consequences. From the side of the Gaza-based factions, but the reason I say Gaza-based factions is because Hamas was not the only group involved in the rocket fire. We also had PIJs and the Salafist groups. One was the elections. Like I mentioned, that Fatah and Hamas had decided to hold elections in the West Bank and Gaza Strip in June, and these were postponed. Hamas does not have, it has a lot of influence in the Gaza Strip, but it does not have much influence in the West Bank. And if you ever travel, in fact, and talk to the people in the West Bank, they are very opposed to Hamas because they feel that every time they reach some sort of resolution, Hamas increases tensions and sort of, all the negotiations sort of fall apart. So they are actually very pro-Fatah, and Hamas has been trying, for a very long time to kind of get a foothold in the West Bank, and by showing initially that that Hamas cares about the Palestinians that live in the West Bank and that it's standing up for these people. The main aim was to kind of undermine Fatah and gain this kind of influence, so that when elections do take place, Hamas is able to win those elections. The second thing for Hamas was that the targeting of residential buildings was an absolute red line. So Hamas, a lot of the headquarters and weapons depots are within, high-rise buildings in the Gaza Strip. And this is done deliberately, knowing that, Israel, if, only during times of like major escalation would Israel ever attack residential buildings, because this would turn international opinion against Israel. And at this point, because hostilities escalated so much and Israel did attack residential buildings, this was considered a red line by Hamas. One thing to keep in mind also, by the way, which a lot of news agencies are now going to tell you, both sides still showed a lot of restraint in order to ensure an all-out war. Whenever Israel attacked residential buildings, it would announce and ask civilians to kind of evacuate. Same thing Hamas did. Hamas would release statements saying that by this time, if Israel did not, agree to a ceasefire, or at this point did not stop attacking residential buildings, it would start firing rockets at Tel Aviv. So I actually had colleagues who, 15 minutes before that deadline would go sit in the bomb shelters with their laptops. So essentially, again, all the news likes to portray this as a very black and white conflict, but it's been going on for so long that both sides know it would be mutually assured destruction at this point. So even at times of such high escalation, we see both sides actually showing a lot of restraint, because while they want to send a message, they also don't want an all-out war, which would be harmful for both sides. So eventually, after about 10 to 12 days, we had a tentative ceasefire that was signed between the two sides. And what was really interesting about the ceasefire, as compared to even the past ceasefires, is that it was an unconditional ceasefire. And that's not happened in the past 4 to 5 years that I've been covering the region. And the reason why both sides sort of signed the ceasefire is because first thing from Israel's point of view, at this point, they had already destroyed significant Hamas infrastructure, killed a lot of the top leadership of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So it had sort of already restored deterrence, which was its aim. From this point of view of Hamas, was that if hostilities continued, that meant more damage to its ranks and its capabilities. But at this point, if a ceasefire was signed, it would be able to, declare victory and say that it had won this round of hostilities. And by the way, when the ceasefire was finally signed, which was mediated by Egypt, it was on 21st May. I think it came into effect at around 2 in the morning. As opposed to previous rounds of escalation, this was the end. Like in previously, we used to still see some rockets being fired into Israel, a few Israeli airstrikes, but this time it was an actual unconditional ceasefire. Both sides, have in fact till today have been respecting it, which has been very, very surprising. And what was interesting about the ceasefire is also that it has triggered negotiations for a permanent ceasefire between the two sides. So in fact, Egypt has sent two delegations to the Gaza Strip to talk to Hamas leadership over the past 2 weeks to discuss a permanent ceasefire. And Hamas has in fact agreed to negotiate on this. And it has also agreed to a possibility of a prisoner exchange with Israel. The Israeli Foreign Minister, Gabi Ashkenazi, just went to Egypt a few days ago. This was, in fact, the first trip of an Israeli foreign minister to Egypt in 13 years, and where he also agreed to negotiations for a permanent ceasefire with Hamas and the possibility of a prisoner exchange with Hamas. And this is, while they have had such talks in the past, this is, in fact, the first time the two sides have almost completely agreed to negotiate at the same time. But at this, I mentioned, ceasefires in conflict zones are very, very fragile. And the reason being, and one of the primary reasons in this conflict, is the presence of multiple groups operating on the ground in the Gaza Strip. Like I mentioned, you don't just have Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, we also have multiple Salafist groups who are opposed to Hamas. And what these groups have done in the past in order to undermine Hamas, and because they're also, by the way, very, very opposed to any kind of negotiations and ceasefires with Israel, in order to undermine ceasefire negotiations between the two sides, they've launched rockets into Israel. And this is knowing that Israel will retaliate, and it will retaliate against Hamas. And this is because Israel has outright said that it holds Hamas responsible for any kind of security incidents from the Gaza Strip, because Hamas is, responsible for administering the Gaza Strip. Now, keep in mind, Israel also knows a lot of times that these aren't launched by Hamas. So during these times, the retaliation is usually symbolic. They usually attack, they conduct airstrikes on open areas just to kind of send a message. But these have in the past, again, miscalculation by either side, especially if it leads to casualties on the Israeli side, it's led to escalations and has seriously undermined the ceasefire efforts. So in fact, we've seen, when these rockets have been launched again against Israel, and how we know, in fact, that, it was not Hamas behind them, is that we've seen major arrest raids launched by Hamas against these groups in the Gaza Strip to stop them and to kind of bring them under control and prevent them from undermining the ceasefire negotiations. So while right now we have not seen, the resumption of hostilities between the two sides, it's important to keep in mind that the ceasefire is very, very fragile, especially when negotiations for a permanent ceasefire start. This is not something that is going to be easily accepted by a lot of the groups in the Gaza Strip, including the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Aside from these groups, also there are dissidents within Hamas and PIJ who are against any kind of ceasefire with Israel or any kind of permanent agreement with Israel. So they have also in the past, tried to undermine these efforts. So keeping all of this in mind, over the coming, even weeks and months, the ceasefire is going to be very, very fragile. And negotiations over a permanent ceasefire are probably going to take months or even years to be realistic. Aside from, the ceasefire being fragile, from all of this, tensions are still very high in, other parts of Israel and the West Bank. And, the bottom line is that while a ceasefire has been signed and we haven't seen an escalation again, who actually won? Like, everybody's talking about victory. Both sides have declared that, they won this round of the conflict, but essentially on the ground, who has made more headway? And in my opinion, that is Hamas. And the reason why I say that is because Hamas has actually gained a lot of influence amongst Palestinians, which it didn't have. And within Gaza, while it had that, for the first time ever, we saw rallies celebrating Hamas and the ceasefire taking place in the West Bank, which we had never ever seen in the past, at least in the past 5 to 6 years. The international opinion has turned against Israel significantly. Also, Hamas has managed to increase the risk associated with operating in central Israel. And a lot of Israel's economic infrastructure, its main economic hubs are Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, which is a town north of Tel Aviv. And so it's basically increased the risk associated with operating in Israel, which could impact the country's economy. And while Israel, again, Israel has also won something out of this. It's managed to, restore deterrence, and it's managed to stop the escalation, and it's managed to destroy a lot of Hamas infrastructure and kill a lot of the PIJ top leadership. But tensions are still very, very high. The security situation hasn't changed much for Israel. The tensions are very high still in mixed Jewish Arab towns within Israel. The stability, the security stability within the country has sort of gone down. We're also seeing increased unrest in the West Bank, where we're still seeing a lot of attacks between the two communities. And we're also facing a possible increase in Hamas's influence in the West Bank. And the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority has been significantly undermined. If Hamas does manage to gain a much stronger foothold in the West Bank, Hamas in the past, we've seen them, through its influence, they managed to organize cells in the West Bank. And like I said, Gaza Strip's under blockade, so nobody can come out of Gaza. But thousands, I think about 3,000 Palestinians, they travel every day from the West Bank to Israel for work. And we've seen in the past that some of these cells that are organized by Hamas, they try to kind of disguise themselves as workers, and they've sort of infiltrated into Israel to try to conduct attacks. And this we especially saw during the first and second Intifadas, and also later on, more recently. So if Hamas does manage to gain a stronger foothold, even if it's not through victory in elections, but in general more influence, that could significantly stabilize West Bank and undermine Fatah, and that could also undermine Israel's security coordination with the Palestinian Authority. And the last thing, which is of major concern, not just for Israel, but also for the Saudi-led Gulf bloc, is that it could significantly increase Iranian influence through Hamas in the West Bank. Israel already at this point, all of its borders are, with Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza Strip already have, these countries already have proxies who have very, very close ties with Iran. So with Hamas possibly gaining influence in the West Bank would mean another major security threat for Israel, but also a major security threat for Fatah, since Fatah and Hamas, aren't at all in good terms. And just to underscore that statement, Hamas has tried to, assassinate Fatah leaders, even the, Mahmoud Abbas, who's the leader of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank in the past. So yeah, that's basically the end of my presentation. I'm open to any questions that all of you may have now.
So questions will be in the chat box. Can you open the chat box?
Yes. I'm so sorry. Somebody had messaged me a while back to speak a bit slowly. I'm sorry I didn't see your question earlier. But yeah, if you have any questions now.
Questions. Can you see the chat? There are lots of questions.
Just 1 second. Okay. Hold on. I'm going to scroll up.
So start from 952.
Okay, I'll start from 952. Okay, so the first question is, where does PLO stand in all of this? The PLO, to some extent, it doesn't really, it basically has absolutely no influence as such in, in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip at all. We have a few PLO sort of cells operating in Europe, for that matter, and maybe even in Lebanon. But in terms of the on-ground situation in West Bank and Gaza Strip, it doesn't have, it has like no influence at this point. Are Palestinians Muslims? Yeah, Palestinians are almost entirely Muslims. 99% of the Palestinian population is in fact Sunni Muslims. Fatah is not active in the armed conflict, not the conflict that took place this time. In fact, it's not been active in armed conflict against Israel for quite a while. But yes, tensions have always been there. Fatah and Israel's tensions usually manifest more diplomatically. And Fatah has very close, like I said, security coordination with Israel, and they also have diplomatic ties. So it's been more symbolic and more diplomatic. Israel does rely a lot on Fatah for security in the West Bank and also security along its borders, and so does Fatah. Fatah also relies a lot on Israel for for its economy and for security coordination. But yeah, it has not engaged in direct armed conflict vis-a-vis Israel in the past, I think, at least 5 to 6 years. Um, what should be India's stand in this conflict? That's actually a very, very complicated question. I'm not sure if I can tell you what should India's stand be. I can tell you what the pros and cons would be to some extent. Is India has always had sort of close ties with both sides, both the Palestinians as well as the Israelis. The reason being, first is the Palestinian Israel India, of course, has a it has the second largest Muslim community in the world after Indonesia. And it's never, in fact, taken a very strict stance, either against Israel. It has to some extent supported the Palestinian cause in the past, but it's remained neutral in the conflict to a very large extent. And while it has expressed, support for the Palestinians, Israel is India imports. It's the largest, weapons exporter to India after Russia. And India has very, very close defense cooperation with the Israelis. So both sides, to be very honest, India has taken more of a neutral stance because it also, in its own foreign policy interests, that's been more advantageous for India. Now, what should the stance be? I'm going to leave it up to you guys to kind of decide what that should be. Why is US supporting Israel? Okay, so this is actually a very, very historical, very sort of, lots of issues that we can go into. But one primary issue that I can say, there are two things, in fact. Israel has, in fact, been one of the US's main strategic ally in the Middle East. As you know, the US is involved in a lot of conflicts in the Middle East, and Israel has been one, sort of ally that they've almost entirely relied upon to be able to operate, to be able to sort of keep track. The other is that the Jewish lobby in the US is very strong. So if you normally see, the Democrats in the US are usually, even though they are pro-Israel because of the strategic alliance, but aside from that, also economic cooperation. But aside from that, the Democrats usually take a more sort of, they're more pro a two-state solution. They've taken a slightly more neutral stance than the Republicans. That's because the Republicans, their sort of campaign lobby, a lot of them are basically very, very high ranking the Jewish community and also the gun lobby. And so the Republicans actually rely a lot on that for campaign funding. So if you normally see, it's, the Republicans are usually, more, they've been more upfront about being pro-Israel. And also ideologically for the Republicans, it's sort of aligns. But again, it's a much more complex issue. I'm really like dumbing this down because we don't have the time to go into, the intricacies of all of this. Okay, the next one is, what was the Intifad? Intifad, actually, there were two Intifads. It was the first Intifad and the second Intifad. They took place in the 1980s and 1990s. It ended towards the beginning of 2000s. This was a campaign launched by Hamas, and also Fatah was at this point also involved, where we saw massive, massive suicide bombings across Israel. We saw a lot of attacks. This was at bus stops, nightclubs. We saw this was like almost all-out war, I would say, between the two sides, between Israel and the Palestinians. We saw a lot of Israeli operations against the Palestinians at this point. So this was almost, I would say, a civil war, and between the two sides. Again, the reasons why the Intifada sort of took place are much more complicated, and we'd have to really go into the history of the two, of the region for this. But that's essentially what Intifada was in sort of a nutshell. Okay, why does Hamas not attack Tel Aviv? the main thing is Hamas does have long-range weapons. In fact, during this conflict, they revealed a new rocket which can essentially reach northern Israel. And the reason being, like I mentioned, is both sides show a lot of restraint in terms of escalation. A lot of times, it's just about sending message and maintaining the status quo, and sort of, if letting the other side know that this is our red line. We're not going to tolerate more than this. But neither side wants a major all-out war, because that would, like I said, it would mean mutually assured destruction for both sides. And Hamas in the past has refrained from attacking Tel Aviv for that very reason that we saw, like this time, is that attacking Tel Aviv means that you're going to escalate the conflict to a level where you cannot afford to take the losses that are going to be incurred upon your ranks and infrastructure and capabilities. Can this issue ever be solved completely? Honestly, anybody who's in my field has been asking this question, and I don't think anybody has an answer. It's very complicated. If you ever go visit Israel or the Palestinian territories, there are people, who are pro two-state solutions. You'll see the left-wing Jews are very pro that, but you also have, a lot of Palestinians who are pro that. But then you also have the more hardliners within the West Bank who don't want a two-state solution or any negotiation with Israel. And you also have the right-wing Jews. There are lots of far-right groups which don't want a two-state solution at all. So it's sort of, at this point, it's more of a status quo. We did see some compromises that both sides are willing to make, but the main issue is, are the two sides willing to make significant compromises? And are they willing to lose domestic politics and elections over that? So it's honestly, it's difficult to say. I think at this point, the most we can hope for is that we don't have more escalations, and the status quo to some extent gets maintained and relations improve a bit. So at least the quality of life on both sides can improve. What is the religious aspect of the whole story? This is actually a very, very interesting question. The religious aspect is the fight is all over the land on which you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So basically, this is going back 2,000 years or even more. The Jews actually had their temple, the first temple, and there were 2 to 3 temples which were all destroyed over time, some by the Romans, some by the Ottoman Empire. But essentially, that was the Jews' holiest site. And it's where, it's again, I'm not going to go into the Torah and the religious thing, but it's basically the most religious site. And also you have, for the Muslims, that is their most religious site after Mecca and Medina, because that's where I think it was Ibrahim who gave the book to somebody. Again, I'm not an expert on religious issues, but essentially it is the most religious site for the Muslims. And the main issue here is that according to Islam, essentially, they've actually been proposals that, Al-Aqsa Mosque stands, and obviously, nobody's going to break it down. In fact, the Western Wall that is mentioned, that is the last remaining sort of wall. It used to be the wall of the Jewish temple after it was destroyed, and that's where the Jews pray right now. But the whole thing is that the mosque stands, and in fact, today, Al-Aqsa Mosque is neither under Israeli authority nor under the Palestinian Authority. It's under this independent organization called the Waqf, which is under Jordanian authority. So technically, Al-Aqsa Mosque, that compound, is under Jordan. It's not under either of these two. These clashes usually start off because there is a certain section where the Jews can go and pray, but a lot of Palestinians have said that that's infringing upon their religious freedom, because according to Islam, wherever they pray, no other community can pray. So, and also that's a very holy site for the Christians. So essentially, that's the whole religious aspect. It all goes back to the Torah, the Quran, and the New Testament, essentially. Do you think the permanent ceasefire is possible? I do think it's being a bit optimistic, but it is possible. Both sides do want to end the escalation. But like I said, keep in mind, there are a lot of groups on both sides that do not want a ceasefire. And any small sort of miscalculation usually tends to lead to hostilities and undermine ceasefire negotiations. The first step would definitely be negotiations, them willing to talk. And the second step would be a prisoner exchange, because there are still quite a few, obviously, Hamas leaders that Israel has in its prisons, but there are also quite a few Israeli civilians and soldiers that are currently under Hamas custody, which Israel has been asking them to release for quite a while. Thank you, Tanishka, for the compliment. Can you please tell me more about political turmoil in Israel? Political turmoil. So basically, I'm assuming you're talking about the election. So the election, we sort of have to go into, the political parties. There are multiple political parties in the Knesset. You have left-wing parties, you have center parties, and you have right-wing parties. And you also have two prominent Arab parties. And essentially, till, before 2 years ago, Netanyahu was able to, his Likud party was able to win a majority, or if not an absolute majority, they managed to form, they just needed a small amount of support to form a coalition government. But after Netanyahu was indicted on corruption charges, he lost the support of a lot of his allies. And because that, he had to rely more and more on right-wing parties, and also eventually, after the fourth election, on the Arab parties to form a coalition government. And because none of them were even close to an absolute majority. And so that's why we've actually reached a point that almost all of the parties are so against Netanyahu, they formed a coalition, a bloc called the anti-Netanyahu bloc. And in fact, we've been seeing a lot of demonstrations in Israel for like the past 2 years against Netanyahu. So essentially at this point, the center parties and the right-wing parties and even the Arab parties are willing to all come together just to make sure that Netanyahu doesn't come back to power. And we'll know in a few hours whether they manage to form a government or not. Thank you, Charvi. Can you please take on Fateh in brief again? So Fateh has existed forever. In fact, before the 1990s, before Yasser Arafat, Fateh was like, you guys talked, somebody asked me about Fateh being involved in armed conflict. Fateh was involved in armed conflict with Israel. It had fought in all of the wars up until 1973, Yom Kippur War, also involved in the second Intifada. But in the late 1990s, when Yasser Arafat signed the Oslo Accord with Israel and sort of signed a peace agreement in some ways, Fateh has taken a very non-violent sort of stance towards Israel. They've had diplomatic relations. Both sides have, increased, like I mentioned, increased security coordination. They've been cooperating to a large extent to kind of come to a peaceful sort of political solution to the conflict. Things really, really actually got complicated after Hamas won the elections in 2006. And since then, everything's sort of been on hold. And so that's why, like I said, Fateh's sort of relations with Israel as well as Hamas have been really shaky. And, every few months they kind of change. Next question, I think I've already answered. Will Isaac Herzog election bring a change to political turmoil or geopolitics of entire issue? Honestly, I don't think any kind of election at this point, even within Israel, it's not going to have too much of an impact on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in my honest opinion. Because again, a lot of Israeli policies, at least in terms of Gaza Strip, have been very reactionary. West Bank, yes, they've been more active, but then there they have a much more, much stronger coordination with, Fateh. But one thing which I think could be a bit problematic is when you have an absolute majority government, you can take much more, a much more decisive action. There aren't too many hurdles to implementation, legislation, but with coalition government, that becomes much more problematic because, you could have right-wing parties, for example, because even the center parties are highly reliant on the right wing. So Yair Lapid, he's the center guy who's forming the government, will really be dependent on Naftali Bennett, who's the head of the New Right Party, because anytime escalation breaks out and the right wing starts putting pressure on the prime minister that they need to take a harsher stance against Hamas or they'll pull out of the government. So the prime minister, even if he's from the center party, is going to be really like sort of restrained and will have his hands bound by internal politics and the way he, that will define a lot of his foreign policy. Name of the Temple Mount in Islam, it's Al-Aqsa Mosque, essentially. It's Al-Aqsa Mosque / Temple Mount compound. Why I say compound is because there's like a huge courtyard around it. So it's sort of like a compound, walled off compound. Israel won against Hamas. Israel could have occupied Gaza, but they didn't. Yes, to some extent, yes, definitely. Israel did get a lot out of this conflict. It did achieve its goals. Hamas also achieved some of its goals. And if you look at in terms of casualty and all of that, definitely Israel came out on top. And in terms of destruction, long term, I think, in my opinion, again, long term, I think the way strategic geopolitical sort of ties go and all of those things go, in terms of influence, that I think I was talking more in terms of that. But yeah, I mean, that's totally up for debate, to be honest. Okay. Is there any vested interest to keep the issue escalated in economic terms? So honestly, I don't. To some extent, I wouldn't say to. So for Israel, it does get a lot of aid from the US and a lot of other countries. But there's one thing to keep in mind, that this escalation is also very economically harmful for Israel, because each of that missile that I talked about, Iron Dome missile, costs $40,000 to make. And one entire battery costs over $50 million. So to be very honest, economically, war is bad for everyone. Even for Hamas, economically, it's bad. And so is it for Fatah. And while Fatah does get a lot of funding from the UNRWA and a lot of countries in Europe, again, it would gain much more if there was no conflict, because both sides could actually boost bilateral economic ties. So overall, honestly, I think there could be short-term economic benefits to it, but long-term, it's the lack of armed conflict would benefit both sides more. Next question, I think, sort of answered.
Lots of questions are there that are repetitive, Akshita. So
yeah.
Can you please choose 2 to 4 questions, and
okay.
Then we can wind it up. You can probably just skim through.
Okay. So the one question I'll take is, whom does Sheikh Jarrah belong? So Sheikh Jarrah is basically in East Jerusalem. It's technically under the Palestinian Authority, but East Jerusalem sort of falls, I think, in zone B or C. I'm slightly unsure about that, but it's sort of where the Palestinian Authority and Israel coordinate the security cooperation, sort of cooperate over there. East Jerusalem status is very, very complicated because Israel says that it should be part of Israeli territory. It should be part of Israel. The Palestinians want East Jerusalem to be their capital. Some countries have recognized East Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, some as the capital of the Palestinian territories. Some have said Ramallah should be, which is another town where the Palestinian Authority is seated. So technically, the status of East Jerusalem is sort of complicated. So it's legally, according to international law, I can't really say where it falls, but yeah, it's within East Jerusalem. It's administratively under the Palestinian Authority, but security coordination-wise, both are sort of present. Okay, let's see. Honestly, the next one about Al-Aqsa Mosque being cordoned off, it's tough to say. I think it was both to some extent. Again, in some ways, it was gatherings, Corona gatherings, but because also knowing Israel also did not want, they know the ramifications of like shutting off Al-Aqsa Mosque, to the Palestinians could lead to major escalation, which is never in Israel's favor. In some ways, it's also about security concerns, because normally the period of Ramzan sees a lot of increase in attacks against the Jewish community. So some of it, I think, was security concerns. Some of it was health concerns. Why do the 4 quarters in the old city have an Armenian quarter? That's actually very interesting. Again, it's a very historical thing. It actually a really religious context. You had the Armenian Christians, which are the Orthodox sort of Christians. They also, it's a very holy site for them as well. This is a slightly different issue. We've had the Armenian genocide in Turkey. We've also had like the Armenians sort of being repressed all across the Middle East and even Europe. But yeah, essentially it's one of their holy sites also. So that's why we have an Armenian quarter in the old city. Let's see. If Palestinians are Sunni, then why does Iran, a Shia country, support them always and not so much? Then are they supported by Saudi? That's actually a very, very interesting question. And um, I don't have a very straight answer for this. It's a very historical answer. It's in 1967, I think. So basically, when you had the revolution in Iran and you had the Ayatollahs essentially come to power, they were extremely against the state of Israel being formed. Even before that, Iran was against it, but it became more hard line against Israel after that. Under the Shah of Iran, it used to be, it used to support the Palestinian cause like all the other, sort of Muslim countries in the Middle East. But and there that time it was not so much about Shia Sunni, but it was just about supporting the Palestinians as a whole. But after the Ayatollah sort of came to power, we saw, and they were extremely against the US. And with the US and Israel being such close allies, that kind of factored in to Iran's support for the Palestinians. Again, the Palestinians are supported by Saudi and UAE. In fact, outright, these countries have, sort of always supported the Palestinians. The dynamics have changed, though, over the past 1 year or two, a few years, in fact, I won't even say 1 year. A lot of these countries have recognized the state of Israel. And the main reason, and I think I'll sort of take this as the last question because it's slightly more complicated and actually quite interesting, is that the main reason for this is all of these countries honestly believe that the threat from Iran is much, much higher than the threat from even the Islamic State or Israel or any of that stuff. So in fact, these countries have become becoming closer with Israel because of a common enemy. And we've seen more security coordination between these countries. We also saw the normalization. By the way, security coordination with these countries were always there with Israel. It was just about diplomatically and outright, sort of announcing that they recognize the state of Israel and allowing Israelis to travel to their countries and establishing economic ties. But they've always had, intelligence cooperation. It's been covert, though, covert. And so it's more about sort of like forming the anti-Iran bloc and, security concerns stemming from Iran's growing influence in the Middle East. But again, these countries have been pro-Palestinian. They do take a stance against Israel. But like I said, all countries at the end of the day are looking at their own foreign policy interests. And those will always trump that of, a cause that they have to take up. And especially since this conflict has been going on for over 7 decades, they honestly feel that it's better to kind of take a diplomatic track or, kind of get leverage. But this is actually, I'd sort of take it a bit further and say this is actually also a growing concern in Iran. So while the Ayatollahs are very, very, the Iranian government is very pro-Palestinian and very anti-Israel, we're seeing a increase in, past few years, we've been seeing an increase in anti-government sentiments in Iran. We, in fact, in 2019, we saw large-scale protests in Iran where the Iranian people actually came out outright and, asked for the government to step down. And it asked the Ayatollahs essentially to, stop caring about Palestinians and Lebanon and what's happening in Syria and start focusing on their own people. And that's because the economy of Iran, even before COVID-19 hit, it's been, tanking. It's in a terrible state. The Iranian rial has like devalued. It's completely crashed. So the people are getting more and more disillusioned because what the Iranian government's been doing is that every time there is a domestic policy issue that they want to distract from the local population's attention away from, they escalate things with Israel and the US. And people are starting to realize that a lot of the people in Iran are getting really, really honestly sick of it. So we saw these large scale protests where outright people came out and with flags saying, we don't care what's happening over there. We care about what's happening to us. We don't have livelihoods. We don't have jobs. So a lot of it, to be honest, is also at the end of the day, it's disillusionment with conflict, and economic sometimes issues taking precedent. You can care about what's happening in other regions. You can care about foreign policy if you have food to eat. If that's your main concern, everything else takes, sort of backseat. Okay. Subi, do we have any more time for questions?
Yeah, if there is any relevant question, we can take a couple of questions, because they are one thing is leading to another. As I can see, one comment or one answer is leading to another question to another question. So we can take a couple of more questions if you want, and then.
Okay, so Oslo Accords were signed between Palestinians and Israel, or Hamas and Israel, and how many times they have been signed? So Oslo Accords was signed just once, and it's kind of set the security coordination, between them. It has multiple things, like multiple aspects to it, but that's one of the most prominent. It was signed between the Palestinian Authority, which is essentially supposed to be the government for both Gaza Strip and West Bank. But at that point, Fatah was leading the Palestinian Authority. Hamas was also part of the government, but it didn't have a majority in the government at that point. So Fatah, it was signed between the Palestinian Authority and Israel under Fatah leadership, essentially. Hamas refused to recognize it once they won a majority in the Palestinian Authority. Weren't there 3 intifadas? No, officially there were 2 intifadas. Unofficially, people are calling this round of escalation, a sort of shadow intifada. Like, it's a weird term, but let's see. Who has better military capabilities, Israel or Hamas? Hands down, Israel. Israel has the strongest army and intelligence agencies in the Middle East, which is followed by Egypt, Jordan, and then Morocco. Hamas does have very good military capabilities. In fact, it's the only non-state actor after Hezbollah. Hezbollah, to some extent, has become a state actor now because it has a majority in the parliament of Lebanon. But after Hezbollah, it's the only non-state actor in the world which has military capabilities that can rival that of any kind of proper state. And the Houthis in Yemen, their military capabilities are amazing. Let's see. Which government was better in maintaining peace, the right or the left wing? Because during the tenure of Yitzhak Rabin, yes. Okay, that's a very, very interesting question. I would not outright ever go and say that either right wing or left wing have been great, because also keep in mind, peace deals are highly dependent on the context of the conflict at that point in time. So it's not just about whether it's a right wing government in power or left wing government in power. It's also about what the situation is like on the ground at that point, who is also on the other side of the table. When Yitzhak Rabin was there, it was the Fatah, which was leading the Palestinian Authority. Hamas did not have political power at all as such. It still had, influence. It still had, the Al-Qassam brigades and stuff. But it's about who are on both sides of the negotiation table. And of course, yes, Rabin was definitely much more willing to concede on certain points to the Palestinians, but Rabin was killed by a right-wing extremist, Jewish extremist, for those efforts, assassinated for that. So again, we can't keep, domestic politics. We can't keep the overall context of the security situation, and the motivations and the sentiments of both sides if you're trying to negotiate a peace deal. Does international humanitarian aid assistance, which the Palestinians get, diverted to weapon procurement? If yes, what steps have been taken to counter this? This is actually a very, very interesting question. To a large extent, no. You do have proper UN agencies on the ground that monitor the movement of these funds to sort of the NGOs that are on the ground in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But this entire mechanism has been misused by groups to sort of divert funding towards weapons procurement. And in fact, just 2 months ago, we got a report there's another group which operates in the West Bank. It's called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It used to be very, very popular in the West Bank at one point. It's lost a lot of its influence. They were also majorly involved, in past armed conflicts. But PFLP almost primarily at this point has its offices and it operates out of Europe. And what the PFLP has been doing is it's essentially been scamming these aid agencies. And we got reports essentially that they've been setting up fronts of, asking for aid that would be transferred to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And then they have been transferring these funds towards weapons procurement. So yes, there is definitely, people do always, capitalize on these issues to kind of misuse these things. But there is definitely primary aid comes from Europe, and a lot of these, Red Cross and international aid agencies, they closely monitor, the movement of these funds to ensure that they actually reach on the ground to the people who require them. See. Does Fatah support two-state solution? If yes, so why has it been losing popularity among Palestinians? Yes, Fatah does support the two-state solution. Again, like I said, I'm going to divide up Palestinians into the Gaza Strip and West Bank. Fatah has almost entirely lost popularity in the Gaza Strip. And the reason being that the conditions, the economic conditions, and everything in the Gaza Strip are really bad since the blockade has been imposed. And it's basically pushed the Palestinians into a corner. They don't have a very good, economic life, or living conditions are very poor essentially. And because of that, they feel the Fatah is not standing up to, Israel. What Fatah says, on the other hand, is that you need to remove Hamas. Why are you supporting Hamas? And then we can talk. Then, we can have we can lift the blockade. We can have better conditions for you. In the West Bank, Fatah actually does have a lot of support, but from the Palestinians. It is losing some, but it still has support from the Palestinians, because in the West Bank, the living conditions are drastically better. I've actually traveled there. My mom and I have traveled to Bethlehem and from Jerusalem and, around that area. And honestly, it looks like, any small town in India, and except that it's 10 times cleaner. There is no litter on the ground, and the people are super, friendly. So the West Bank is, while its economy is not doing as great as Israel's, the living conditions in the West Bank are much, much better, except in a few refugee camps over there in certain areas. But the economic conditions of the Gaza Strip are starkly different. And so it's sort of like, when we talk about the two areas, the situation is, political, economic, all of that situation is very different. Okay. Do you think the ceasefire would have been reached if Trump was still in power? To be very honest, the US likes to believe it has a lot of say in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it does to some extent when it bothers to, but both sides, there's a major, in fact, even perception in Israel, despite the fact that the US does support Israel, that the US's role in the Middle East is not as, important anymore. And that's, like I mentioned, that's why Israel and a lot of these Gulf countries are coming together, is because overall in the Middle East, there's this perception that when it really comes down to it, the US doesn't stand up for its allies. It leaves them hanging. And especially that, we've seen what's happened in Syria, we've seen what's happened in Iraq, and, also Ukraine, Serbia, all of these countries. So there's this growing perception in the Middle East that US is a diplomatic ally, but when it comes down to it, it doesn't really help you. So that's why a lot of the countries in the Middle East, in fact, are coming together, to form their own blocs. I think it's also one of the reasons why, we had the Qatar crisis in 2017, and Qatar and Saudi-led bloc have become friends again, is because the overall threat that they perceive from Iran is much higher, and they don't really think that US will really do anything when it comes down to it. And so that's why, like I said, the US has lost a lot of its influence in the Middle East, because it's let down a lot of its allies. And the US always takes credit for all the ceasefires that are signed in the region. But the one country which I will almost solely give credit to, followed by one other country, is Egypt. Egypt is almost entirely responsible for the ceasefires, followed by Qatar. Qatar has also negotiated and sort of, kind of mediated a lot of these ceasefire and negotiations between Hamas and Israel. So yeah, the ceasefire would have been signed. It wouldn't have been signed probably if Egypt and Qatar weren't involved. See. We see when US support one country, China and Russia always oppose. But this time when US gave a kind of backing, did Russia and China support Palestine to counter Israel? So to be honest, that is true in certain cases, but I think there is in general this perception, and a lot of people, especially in the field of international relations, are living to a very large extent in this Cold War sort of way of thinking where, if Russia supports one, US supports the other. To some extent, it's true, but it doesn't completely hold this theory of realism, sort of, which is what its balance of power sort of based on. And at the end of the day, it depends on their own foreign policy interests. So, for example, I'll give you another example. So, Russia and China actually do not have so much interest in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They do have some, of course, because of, it affects stability in the Middle East. But Russia, in fact, Russia and the US to some extent cooperate, to some extent, in Syria, for that matter, and to some extent they've cooperated in a lot of other countries. But yes, in general, both Russia and US have been, and same with US and China, they've all been trying to really, really increase their influence in the Middle East. Russia primarily Middle East and North Africa, and China in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So if you see that China is involved a bit in the Middle East, but China has been entirely focused on the African continent in the past decade or so. Russia has, of course, been on the ground in the Middle East. And to some extent, Russia is seen as more of a reliable ally in the Middle East than the US, because in the past 10 years, Russia has backed its allies to the point where it's turned wars in their favor, like we've seen in Syria, where it supports President Bashar al-Assad. He was losing the Syrian conflict, and Russia's completely turned the tides in his favor. And the US supported this group called the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are primarily made up of this community called the Kurds. But when the Kurds needed the US always pulls out. US looks at its own interests, its own domestic policies. I think to some extent also because the US is confined by the fact that it has a democracy. And if it doesn't listen to its own people, the government will fall. In Russia, that's not much of a concern. So foreign policy kind of takes precedence over domestic policy, and they can take more stronger sort of, Putin can take stronger action in terms of the foreign policy aspect without fearing for too much backlash back at home. I hope that answers your question, but the bottom line is Russia, China haven't really given too much. They've in fact just, supported like the ceasefire efforts rather than supporting either the Palestinians or the Israelis. Is Turkey an ally of America or Russia? Okay, that's a slightly very different topic. I'll give you a very short answer so that we don't go off topic. Turkey is part of the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which has the US. And it was, so NATO automatically was against the Warsaw Pact, which was led by Russia during the Cold War. So traditionally, Turkey is an ally of the US, but over the past 2 to 3 years, under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, Russia has become more antagonistic towards the US. This because also it's become increasingly involved in regional conflicts on the ground, especially in Libya and Syria and Iraq against US interests. And also after Turkey decided to buy the S-400 air defense system from Russia, but they have the F-17 fighter jets, which are operational, which as part of being a NATO country, and that could compromise NATO military intelligence and assets and all of this intelligence stuff. And that's actually become a major issue between Turkey and the US. So in fact, Turkey and US at this point are not on very good terms. These are just a few issues that I mentioned. On multiple issues, Turkey and US, in fact, are sort of kind of going apart under Erdogan, growing apart, and Turkey is becoming closer to Russia. But that doesn't mean Turkey and Russia are friends, by the way. They are only slightly even coordinating because they both have similar interests. They're on the opposing ends, by the way, of the war in Syria. They just, they need to cooperate, essentially, out of necessity. Turkey is just striking out on its own. Turkey wants to become like a regional power, like I mentioned about Egypt.
So I think we'll call it a day today.
Yeah.
Right, Akshita? And it was such a lovely session. In fact, we flowed into so many small narratives and discussions, and I hope the students can put everything together. Of course, I think 1 or 2 sessions are not enough, and but at least this session has given them lots of cues to what they have to read up on, and probably even probably do some of their own research, and maybe we can have a follow-up session and take this forward. But it was really, really informative, and so all of us were hooked onto this. So thank you so much for today, and we look forward to doing this again. We can, I'm just asking it here, we can discuss the Saturday thing and probably come up with something for that, right? Guys, I have some more news for you since we are on conflicts. The next conflict which we will take head on is the Indo-Pak conflict. So much closer home. And that will be taken up by Colonel Sanjeet Sahai, who's also attending this session somewhere. So that will be next week. I'll be announcing the Indo-Pak conflict separately to all of you, right? So great, that was really nice, and I think all of us can thank Akshita for her patience, and she's probably been answering questions for 45 minutes now. So that's a lot of string of thank yous, Akshita. So please read them.
Not at all. And, I'm so glad to be here today, and honestly, all of you had really, really good questions and very in depth, and that's why I think a lot of our conversation flowed to so many, interesting topics and totally, sort of interesting ways.
Yes,
but it was great being here.
About the students, I told you they'll be well read and they will have a fair idea. So the session with you was rewarding because now they got perspective. So speaking on your behalf, students, that's what I told Akshita, that you would know basics. Definitely you would know basics very well because you've been studying for your exam. But yes, perspective is what you all sort of needed, which we really, really did get today. Thank you. So have a great evening ahead, everyone. Enjoy your dinner if you haven't eaten already. Great. See you. Bye, Akshita.
Good night. Bye. Thank you. Good night.